Yo, what's up, everyone? It's your boy Disaster. Welcome to a place where there's no turning back. This is a marathon designed to put you under. Whether it's scorching summer or a rainy spring outside, forget about it. In here, the rain never stops, and the year is nothing but a bone-chilling, frozen winter. The sky out there? It's never gonna clear up. Here's the deal, and I need you to follow my lead. Get to your room, kill the lights, and throw on your headphones. Lay back, get comfortable, and hit that auto replay setting. Close both eyes, and listen till the very end. I'm telling you, the dread levels are gonna spike with every passing minute. And look, before we dive into the abyss, if you feel like this hour of horror is worth it, smash that like button. It doesn't cost you a dime, but it means the world to me. I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into crafting this hour-long nightmare just for you. Brace yourself, boss, it's time for some ice-cold horror. Enjoy the ride. New York, October 2001. A cold, biting, freezing rain lashed incessantly against the dark asphalt of Manhattan, and the entire financial district was swallowed in an unnerving, heavy silence that felt suffocating and oppressive. In the old, soot-stained industrial brick building tucked right near the damp, mist-shrouded harbor, Richard Vance had locked himself tight inside his top-floor apartment in Unit 4B, trembling behind multiple layers of security. The man had systematically destroyed the lives of dozens of hardworking families and elderly retirees after stealing their entire life savings in a brutal, highly coordinated stock market manipulation scheme, subsequently fleeing the federal investigators and hiding out in the shadows of the old port. At exactly 2 a.m., the downstairs neighbors in Unit 3B were jolted awake by a heavy, deadened thud of a steel crowbar striking solid wood, followed immediately by the agonizing, fingernail-on-chalkboard scrape of massive furniture being dragged across the bare wooden floorboards upstairs. When the emergency police unit finally arrived after repeated panic calls from the residents, they found the reinforced heavy-core apartment door deadbolted securely from the inside with 3 massive auxiliary steel drop locks. Kicking it open with a heavy pneumatic battering ram, they swept the threshold with their high-intensity flashlights, stepping straight into an absolute, freezing nightmare. The spacious living room had been stripped completely bare of all curtains, rugs, and furniture. The 4 old plaster walls were entirely covered in heavy, industrial-grade galvanized sheet metal bolted directly into the masonry with thick steel screws. In the absolute center of the room sat 4 lifeless bodies of former investors who had been financially ruined by Vance, laid out in a precise, chilling geometric circle with their hands manacled tightly to a heavy steel anchor ring embedded deep in the floor. Every single one of them had sustained a single, surgical, deep-penetrating stab wound straight to the heart, yet not a single drop of blood stained the floorboards. The killer had meticulously bleached and cleaned every square inch of the room before vanishing. As the lead detective inspected the gruesome circle, forensic teams combed the perimeter and discovered that the apartment's central air ventilation shaft had been systematically unscrewed from the inside using a specialized star-bit screwdriver. Below the vent, an old service ladder dropped down 50 vertical feet into a dark, forgotten 1920s utility maintenance tunnel running directly beneath the harbor's waterline. Further examination of the master bedroom revealed that Richard Vance's personal wall safe had been blown open with a miniature thermal torch, and all incriminating financial records, bearer bonds, and foreign passport copies had been sliced into fine confetti. On the galvanized steel wall right above the empty safe, a message had been aggressively gouged into the metal using a sharp diamond-tipped scriber, reading, asterisk, the ledger is balanced in full. Asterisk. Resting on a small plastic milk crate in the corner was a battery-operated microcassette recorder with its play button jammed down by a piece of electrical tape. When the audio technician pressed stop and rewound the magnetic tape to the beginning, the speaker emitted a chilling sequence. First, the heavy, rhythmic drumming of rain against the window glass. Second, the sharp click of a steel lock engaging. And third, the terrified, trembling voice of Richard Vance reading out loud the names of the 39 families he had defrauded, one by one, spaced out by exact 10-second intervals of dead, agonizing silence. The cassette clicked off with a mechanical snap, and to this day, law enforcement files remain wide open because neither Richard Vance nor the executioner was ever located. Apartment 4B remains permanently sealed under a federal court injunction, and the tenants living in the building swear that every time a cold autumn storm rolls in off the Atlantic, you can distinctly hear the grating sound of iron deadbolts turning in the dark above. The immediate federal manhunt for Richard Vance turned up zero movement, zero credit card activity, and zero border crossings, as if the architect of the multi-million-dollar financial collapse had evaporated into the heavy New York fog. The 3 detectives assigned to the homicide detail spent 48 consecutive hours locked inside the freezing, metal-paneled confines of apartment 4B, breathing in the lingering scent of industrial bleach and stagnant harbor moisture while combing through every square inch of the stripped-down rooms. They hauled in portable X-ray machines to scan the newly installed galvanized steel walls, only to discover that the metal sheets had been layered directly over thick blocks of sound-dampening acoustic foam, explaining why the downstairs neighbors had heard nothing of the 4 executions except the initial muffled drag of furniture. Down in the subterranean 1920s utility maintenance tunnel directly beneath the building's foundation, forensic sweeps uncovered a set of wet, heavy rubber boot impressions leading toward the dilapidated drainage pipes that emptied straight into the East River. However, tracking dogs brought to the mouth of the tunnel refused to enter the concrete bore, sitting back on their haunches and whining frantically toward the dark water, signaling that the trail had been deliberately chemically masked or that the scent simply stopped dead at the threshold. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the microcassette recovered from the plastic milk crate was handed over to the audio forensics lab for enhancement and frequency filtering to extract any background noise hidden beneath Richard Vance's terrified voice reading the names of his 39 victims. When the audio engineers stripped away the heavy hiss of the rain and the clicking of the steel locks, a terrifying secondary layer of sound emerged from the magnetic tape, a low, distorted mechanical breathing rhythm interspersed with the faint, rhythmic ticking of an analog pocket watch. Even more disturbing, when investigators cross-referenced the precise timing of the cassette's recording with the medical examiner's estimated time of death for the 4 seated investors, they realized something mathematically impossible. The cassette had run for exactly 42 minutes, yet the microtape mechanism had been locked in the play position while the physical tape spool itself was completely blank for the first 28 minutes, meaning Vance had been forced to sit in the dark and recite the names into a dead, unrecording machine long before the tape finally caught his voice. By the 3rd day, federal banking regulators discovered that every single offshore account, shell corporation, and hidden asset belonging to Richard Vance had been systematically liquidated and transferred into an untraceable charity fund for the families he had ruined, down to the very last cent. The case file was officially classified as an unsolved federal disappearance, but the primary investigator quietly resigned from the force 6 months later after leaving a note on his precinct desk stating that the locks in apartment 4B were turning themselves from the inside. To this day, the building's management keeps the top floor completely vacant, though nighttime maintenance crews refuse to step foot near the 4th floor hallway, whispering about the cold, rhythmic sound of heavy boots walking down an empty metal corridor where no floorboards remain. December 1990, the high, jagged peaks of the Sintra Mountains in Portugal were completely choked by a dense, suffocating sea fog and a violent, relentless tropical downpour that turned the steep mountain passes into treacherous rivers of mud. Deep within this isolated wilderness sat the crumbling, centuries-old ruins of Quinta da Morte, a notorious stone estate that served as the heavily guarded operational headquarters for a ruthless international antiquities smuggling syndicate commanded by a cunning French operator named Henri Dubrovsky. At precisely 11 p.m., a convoy of 3 black four-wheel-drive all-terrain vehicles tore through the rusted iron perimeter gates of the estate, cutting their headlights instantly and plunging the courtyard into absolute darkness. Inside the grand vaulted reception hall, Dubrovsky and 6 of his armed syndicate lieutenants were huddled around a long oak table stacked with heavy wooden crates filled with stolen gold coins, illegal artifacts, and priceless religious relics smuggled out of Lisbon museums. Without warning, the heavy oak double doors of the courtyard entrance were violently shattered inward from the outside, splintering into 1,000 pieces under the force of a massive, coordinated breach. For syndicate guards stationed at the lower gates didn't even have time to unholster their automatic weapons before a silent, relentless wave of violence tore through the damp shadows of the lower corridor. The estate's primary power generator was instantly crippled by a localized explosive charge placed against the exterior junction box, plunging the sprawling manor into total, pitch-black obscurity punctuated only by the flash of lightning outside the high Gothic windows. Estate guards stationed in the second-floor gallery rushed to the banisters with their submachine guns raised, sweeping the lower floor with weapon-mounted flashlights, but they were picked off one by one with terrifying, mechanical precision. Heavy, razor-sharp steel blades sliced through the damp air with brutal efficiency, delivering deep, fatal torso slashes and clean decapitations that left no room for error or survival. Dubrovsky, realizing that an elite professional hit squad had infiltrated the heavily fortified compound, drew his 9mm sidearm and barricaded himself inside his private executive study, screaming orders into a dead satellite phone while the muffled screams of his dying men echoed up the stone stairwells. The systematic liquidation of the guards took less than 4 breathless minutes from the initial breach to the final, heavy thud of a body hitting the stone floor. When the dust settled and the heavy rain continued to batter the roof tiles overhead, the surviving syndicate members were completely gone, and the silent, blood-soaked courtyard was left entirely to the storm. Outside, the unrelenting downpour hammered relentlessly against the jagged slate roofs and flooded the ancient courtyards, washing thick trickles of dark, crimson water down the stone steps where the syndicate guards had fallen. The air grew intensely cold, carrying the sharp, metallic stench of fresh blood mixed with the damp, rotting odor of centuries-old mountain moss and wet earth. Inside Dubrovsky's reinforced executive study, the French smuggler pressed his back firmly against the heavy mahogany bookshelf, his hands trembling violently as he cocked his service pistol and aimed directly at the reinforced oak door. The muffled sounds of heavy, measured boots stepped deliberately across the stone landing outside his room, pausing for a long, agonizing moment right before the heavy wooden threshold. Without a single word of warning or a demand for surrender, a heavy tactical breaching charge was slapped against the exterior lock mechanism, detonating with a dull, muffled thud that blew the iron hinges straight out of the masonry frame. The door swung inward on its splintered axis, and through the drifting cloud of gray smoke and flying splinters stepped an unblinking, towering figure wrapped in a heavy, drenched oilskin waterproof coat that dripped dark water onto the ruined Persian rug. Dubrovsky opened fire in blind panic, emptying the entire 9mm magazine straight into the center of the intruder's chest with deafening concussions, but the bullet simply punched through the wet canvas fabric without slowing the advance by a single fraction of a second. The figure glided forward with terrifying, mechanical fluidity, reaching across the desk with an iron grip that clamped instantly around Dubrovsky's throat, lifting the grown man effortlessly off his feet while 3 sharp, rhythmic raps echoed from deep within the hollow timber walls outside. The interior of Quinta de Morti grew terrifyingly quiet as the last echoes of violence faded into the relentless drumming of the mountain storm against the rotting window frames. Henri Dubrovsky pressed his back flat against the reinforced oak door of his private study, his chest heaving as cold sweat mixed with rain dripping from his hair. He could hear the deliberate, unhurried footsteps of the intruder approaching across the flagstone hallway outside, heavy, measured boots stepping deliberately over the bodies of his fallen elite guards without a single sign of hesitation. Clutching his handgun with both trembling hands, Dubrovsky raised the barrel toward the lock just as the heavy iron handle slowly began to turn from the outside. With a deafening roar of pure panic, he emptied half his magazine directly through the wooden panel, sending jagged splinters flying across the room and chewing up the stone corridor wall. The footsteps outside stopped instantly. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence, followed by a terrifying, surgical strike. The blade of an exceptionally heavy, razor-sharp antique weapon pierced straight through the center of the solid oak door with the ease of a hot knife slicing through soft butter. The steel blade wrenched violently upward in a brutal, tearing arc, splitting the heavy wood from top to bottom and shattering the iron lock mechanism into useless metal dust. The door swung slowly inward on its warped hinges, revealing a tall, imposing figure completely shrouded in a dark, waterlogged canvas cloak that dripped pools of muddy rainwater onto the antique rug. Dubrovsky tried to pull the trigger again, but his weapon jammed on an empty casing with a sickening click. Without a single word, the intruder stepped across the threshold, raised the weapon high, and drove it downward with overwhelming physical force. The weapon used in the execution was an authentic 17th-century Japanese samurai katana of museum-grade quality, the exact same priceless artifact Dubrovsky had illegally acquired just 1 week prior at a notorious, closed-door black market auction in Madrid. The heavy steel blade sheared straight through Dubrovsky's weapon hand, pinning it to the mahogany desk with surgical precision, before a swift, devastating backhand sweep knocked the crime boss unconscious from sheer shock and blood loss. When Dubrovsky finally clawed his way back to consciousness, the ambient light was an eerie, sickly shade of pre-dawn gray filtering through the shattered windows. He was no longer in his study. He found himself trapped in total, claustrophobic darkness inside a cold, damp subterranean burial cavity beneath the estate's grand hall. The heavy marble lid of an ancient sarcophagus had been slid firmly back into place over his head, sealed securely from the outside by a massive, rusted medieval padlock that mocked his desperate, muffled screams. The air inside the stone crypt was thick with the suffocating stench of centuries-old dust and stagnant earth, and as Dubrovsky frantically clawed at the unyielding stone walls with his remaining hand, his fingers brushed against a small, cold object left behind on the floor of the tomb. It was a fragment of the shattered katana blade, wrapped tightly in a blood-soaked slip of paper bearing his own signature from the Madrid auction house. 2 days later, a local forest ranger patrolling the storm-damaged ridges of the Sintra Mountains noticed the front gates of Quinta de Morti standing wide open in the wind and called the National Gendarmerie. When the tactical unit breached the estate, they found the 4 syndicate enforcers dead on the courtyard flags, arranged in a chilling, equidistant circle around the dry fountain, completely stripped of their identification papers. Inside the grand reception hall, the antique samurai katana was found snapped cleanly in half, driven vertically down with immense, supernatural force deep into the marble sarcophagus sitting in the middle of the room. Beneath the heavy stone lid, the rescue teams pulled a catatonic, utterly broken Henri Dubrovsky from the subfloor crypt, his mind completely shattered by whatever he had experienced in the dark. Hospitalized under heavy armed guard in Lisbon, Dubrovsky refused to touch food, water, or medication, staring blankly at the sterile white ceiling while whispering the exact same phrase over and over in a dry, cracked voice, "He doesn't want the gold, he's here to settle the debt of the blade." 48 hours after his admission, despite locked ward doors and constant surveillance, Dubrovsky vanished entirely from his hospital room without leaving a single footprint, and the Portuguese federal police officially filed the case away as an unsolved phantom execution. November 2003. The misty mountain peaks of Nuwara Eliya in Sri Lanka were swallowed entirely by a brutal monsoon season that lashed the steep terrain. Torrential downpours washed out mountain roads, transforming cascading tea terraces into churning channels of thick red mud that isolated the region. Deep within this fog-drenched wilderness sat an abandoned tea processing mill, a decaying behemoth of rusted corrugated iron, rotting timber, and shattered glass left to rot by the colonial government. In recent months, however, the dead mill had found a new, sinister purpose as the command post for a massive gemstone smuggling ring. The enterprise was operated by Arjuna Ratnayak, a disgraced former military intelligence officer turned syndicate boss who utilized the remote location to launder millions in illegally mined rough blue sapphires. Ratnayak's operation was protected by 20 heavily armed private security mercenaries stationed inside with automatic rifles and night vision gear. At 10 p.m., an anonymous emergency call buzzed the district police headquarters. "There's a slaughter happening at the old mill. Send every unit you have." The local detachment commander cursed, knowing vehicle travel up the mud-choked mountain tracks was impossible. Gathering a 4-man tactical strike team, the officers clawed their way up the steep pass on foot through the freezing sludge, their flashlights cutting through the rain. It took 2 hours to reach the estate. When they breached the rotting timber frame structure, they stepped into a scene of calculated carnage. The lower drying corridors were pitch black, illuminated only by distant lightning flashing through broken roof panels. Sprawled across the floorboards were 6 of Ratnayak's guards, systematically positioned in narrow choke points. The liquidation had been executed with predatory precision, no gunfire had been exchanged, and no alarms had been triggered. Instead, the executioners had moved through the structure using industrial cutting tools and mining drills, picking off guards from the dark rafters above. The wounds were horrific, surgical, and devastating. Stepping deeper, the lead officer signaled for silence as they approached the iron door leading to Ratnayak's private office on the second floor. The heavy door stood slightly ajar, swinging in the cold draft. Drawing their pistols, the officers kicked the door wide open and swept the room. Arjuna Ratnayak sat upright in a leather executive chair, bound to the backrests with thick zip ties. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the wall in catatonic terror. On the mahogany desk in front of him sat raw, unpolished blue sapphires submerged in dirty rainwater leaking through the ceiling. The killer hadn't pocketed a single gemstone or stolen a dollar bill. The primary objective had been total eradication. Every paper ledger, shipping manifest, and encrypted contact list had been dumped into an industrial vat of acid, dissolved into bubbling sludge. Resting on the edge of the mahogany surface, left behind like a death warrant, was a single massive raw blue sapphire snapped cleanly down the middle with geometric precision. It was the universally recognized underworld death sentence among gemstone syndicates, a chilling message signifying that the blood debt had been collected in full. Before the unit could secure the room, a metallic click echoed from the ventilation shaft, followed by heavy boots dropping onto the roof outside. Rushing to the shattered window, the officers peered out into the rain just in time to see a dark silhouette vanishing into the tea plantation. No footprints were left in the mud, no vehicle engines roared, and Ratnayak never spoke another word. The federal case files remained classified, and local tea pickers refused to walk near the mill after dark, swearing industrial drills can still be heard chewing through the wood when the monsoon returns. As the officers stood paralyzed in the chilling dampness of the executive office, the fractured blue sapphire on the desk began to hum with a low, vibrating resonance that made the teeth in their skulls ache. A sudden drop in temperature turned their breath into white fog, and the shattered glass overhead ceased dripping water entirely as the falling droplets froze mid-air, suspended by an unseen, malicious force that filled every corner of the room with absolute, suffocating dread. December 2011. The freezing Swiss Alps were trapped in the grip of a violent blizzard, a catastrophic storm of swirling whiteout powder, gale-force winds, and blinding freezing rain that completely shut down every mountain pass and ski resort across the canton. Deep inside an isolated gorge several thousand feet above sea level sat a railway substation abandoned by the transit authority years prior. In recent months, however, This concrete-reinforced relic had been repurposed as a clandestine offline data archive for a corrupt European wealth management firm tied to elite political laundering rings. Stationed inside the control room were Belgian financial consultant Mark van Dever and 2 armed personal bodyguards hired to oversee the transfer of sensitive files and criminal asset ledgers. The interior was lit only by the harsh glare of an emergency diesel generator humming in the sub-level utility closet, casting jittery shadows across filing cabinets. At 1:15 a.m., all generators failed simultaneously with a sharp pop, plunging the substation into pitch-black obscurity. A freight train engineer crawling his locomotive down the adjacent line reported seeing frantic muzzle flashes and unnatural shadows moving behind the reinforced glass seconds before radio signals died. When the Border Patrol Tactical Unit fought their way up the blocked tracks through 6 feet of snow hours later, they found the station doors unlocked and swinging freely in the freezing wind. Stepping across the threshold with tactical flashlights cutting through the air, the officers swept the corridor and found both bodyguards dead on the floor inside the control room. Both men had been killed by contact-range shots to the skull executed with absolute ballistic precision, clean, silent entries delivered through suppressors without a sign of a struggle. Mark van Dever was completely gone, having vanished as if the mountain had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only his wool overcoat, leather gloves, and expensive wristwatch resting on the desk. The iron filing cabinets containing the financial ledgers had been pried open, their contents stripped bare, leaving the station devoid of the documents the syndicate had risked everything to protect. Without wasting a second, the tactical commander split his strike team and deployed them down into the old Gotthard maintenance tunnel system, a dark subterranean bore stretching 2 kilometers through the heart of the mountain. Moving cautiously through the freezing dampness, the officers swept their lights across the concrete tracks until reaching an alcove midway down the bore. There, stacked on the damp stone floor, they found the heavy wooden archival transport crates broken open, their contents soaked in an industrial chemical solvent and burned down to fine gray ash that drifted lazily in the draft. The assassins had utilized a manual railroad pushcart to silently transport heavy gear deep into the dark tunnel, completely bypassing perimeter security cameras. Halfway down the damp bore, wedged between rusted iron rails, they recovered Mark van Dever's blood-stained jacket and his encrypted satellite phone, which had been smashed to smithereens using an industrial masonry drill bit. The SIM card had been pulverized into dust, and internal memory chips deliberately melted with a blowtorch to ensure zero data recovery. This was never a routine robbery or kidnapping for ransom. Millions of dollars in physical bearer bonds still sat untouched inside the station's open-wall safe, completely ignored by the intruders. The sole objective of the entire operation was the total, irreversible eradication of data implicating high-ranking international political figures in systemic money laundering. Forensic reconstruction confirmed the hit was carried out by a Black Ops wetwork team that synchronized movements with the roar of passing freight trains on the upper tracks to mask the sound of entry and execution. Mark van Dever's body has never been recovered. Swiss authorities officially closed the file under federal classification, and the abandoned substation remains locked away behind steel plates, forgotten by the world beneath the frozen peaks. Route 9 is a desolate, unforgiving stretch of cracked asphalt that cuts straight through more than 80 miles of uninhabited swampland, dense briars, and black water bayous before finally connecting to the distant state interstate, offering zero rest stops, gas stations, cell service, or emergency call boxes for late-night travelers foolish enough to brave the dark. In the freezing, bone-chilling winter of 1991, I was working the brutal graveyard shift from midnight straight through to 8 in the morning at an isolated, run-down gas station sitting right at mile marker 42, entirely surrounded by rusted oil drums, towering weeds, and endless rows of dead marsh grass that rattled endlessly in the cold wind. The shift was usually dead quiet, broken only by the rhythmic, low-frequency electrical hum of the flickering overhead fluorescent lights, the drip of a leaky roof drain in the back storage room, and the heavy wind hissing through the gaps in the warped window frames. I spent those long hours sitting behind a scratched bulletproof glass partition, reading old paperback westerns and drinking lukewarm black coffee from a stained thermos to keep the exhaustion from pulling me under. The station itself was a relic of a forgotten era, featuring 2 manual pumps, an old grease rack out back that hadn't seen a working wrench in a decade, and a gravel lot that collected stagnant puddles of rainwater every time a storm rolled in off the marshes. At precisely 3:15 a.m., during a blinding, freezing downpour that turned the asphalt outside into a black mirror reflecting the sickly green glow of the station sign, an old, dark sedan with severely dented fenders and no visible license plates pulled up smoothly to pump 2 without cutting its blinding high beams. I watched through the thick, rain-streaked security glass as a tall figure wrapped in a heavy, glistening oilskin waterproof coat stepped out of the driver's side, the heavy fabric rustling loudly against the metal door frame in the rising gale. Without hesitation, the figure reached down, grabbed the heavy rubber fuel nozzle from the cradle, and jammed it firmly into the car's fuel tank inlet in total, absolute silence. 5 long minutes ticked by on the cracked wall clock while the mechanical meter clicked over, signaling a full tank of unleaded gas, but the driver never walked over to the lighted night window to hand over cash, swipe a card, or even make brief eye contact. Instead, the figure just stood completely motionless right beside the rear quarter panel of the idling car, the water streaming off the oilskin coat, staring straight through the wet glass with an unblinking, heavy gaze directly at where I sat behind the counter. An uncomfortable prickle of pure dread raced down my spine as I tapped nervously on the wooden counter with my fingernails, waiting for them to move, but the driver remained locked in that rigid posture as the rain hammered louder against the tin roof above. The storm intensified, rattling the corrugated iron panels of the roof and sending violent gusts of wind howling across the flat expanse of the marshlands, yet the figure by pump 2 refused to budge an inch, soaking in the freezing deluge. I reached out slowly, my hand hovering over the master fuel pump shut-off switch on the control panel, wondering if I should hit the cutoff and yell through the intercom to get them moving. Before my finger could press the toggle, the car's engine let out a low, guttural growl, and the figure finally turned away from the window, stepping back into the shadows of the vehicle as the heavy rubber nozzle was yanked violently out of the tank and shoved back into its cradle. As the sedan's tail lights flickered to life and cast a deep, crimson glare across the wet gravel lot, the vehicle didn't pull away toward the highway as expected, but instead cut its engine entirely while remaining parked directly beside the pump. A slow, icy draft swept through the closed building, rattling the keys on the hook behind the register, and when I looked down at the transaction monitor, the digital display had scrambled into a series of jagged, bleeding numbers spelling out my own home address in the valley below. A cold, suffocating wave of unease rippled across my skin as I stared back through the rain-streaked glass at the motionless figure standing beside pump 2, feeling an unnatural weight pressed down against the walls of the small station. The wind outside seemed to die down instantly, replaced by a dead, echoing silence that swallowed the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and left only the sound of my own erratic heartbeat drumming in my ears. Needing to break the tension or force some kind of interaction, I reached out and pressed my palm against the heavy plastic intercom button built into the bottom corner of the security partition, leaning in close to the metal grill. "Pumps shut off, friend," I called out, my voice sounding strained and hollow in the confined space of the booth. "You're all set on fuel. Just drop the cash in the drop slot or come on inside where it's dry." The figure by the car didn't twitch a muscle. They didn't turn their head, reach for their wallet, or make any motion toward the driver's seat. Instead, a harsh, metallic squawk erupted directly from the metal speaker box on my side of the glass, sounding like an automated telecom recording played at maximum volume over heavy, grinding static. Asterisk, the subscriber you are dialing has been disconnected from the network. Asterisk. The mechanical words echoed weirdly in the empty station, clipped and lifeless, repeating twice before cutting off into dead air. Before I could process the surreal absurdity of the reply, the car's engine revved with a sudden, deafening roar, spraying a thick wall of gravel and black muddy water against the front windows of the shop. The dark sedan lurched forward into the downpour, its taillights bleeding red streaks across the wet asphalt as it accelerated rapidly down the pitch-black shoulder of Route 9 and vanished into the swirling fog within seconds. Shaking my head and muttering curses under my breath about weird late-night travelers, I grabbed my heavy yellow raincoat from the hook behind the door, pushed open the squeaking side exit, and stepped out into the freezing puddle-filled lot to check if they had left money on the pump island. The rain hit my face like needles as I walked briskly over to pump 2, shining my flashlight beam across the wet concrete. There was no cash, no credit slip, and no sign of payment anywhere on the metal housing. Instead, right where the rear tires had been spinning in the mud, a single piece of crumpled, waterlogged paper lay half submerged in the swirling runoff water at the edge of the asphalt. I knelt down in the mud, picked up the sodden scrap, and carried it back inside beneath the bright glare of the overhead lights to examine it closely. It was an old, faded gas pump receipt, yellowed around the edges with age and water damage, bearing a stamped date from 17 years earlier, October 14, 1974. The transaction listed on the faded thermal paper recorded the purchase of 8 gallons of regular unleaded fuel at the exact same station, signed at the bottom in dark, looping ink. My breath caught entirely in my throat, freezing me in place as I read the name scrawled neatly across the signature line at the bottom of the receipt, Marcus Vance. It was my own name, written in my exact handwriting, down to the peculiar slant of the letters and the way the loops on the capital letters were formed, even though back in October 1974, I was only 4 years old and living hundreds of miles away on the other side of the state. My hands trembled violently as the paper fluttered against the wooden counter, the ink slowly beginning to blur and fade away under the harsh overhead bulbs as if the physical fibers were dissolving into thin air. I stepped backward toward the wall, my eyes locked on the empty desk where the old analog clock ticked forward in agonizingly slow, deliberate intervals. Before I could even begin to comprehend the utter impossibility of what I was holding, the station's landline telephone suddenly began to ring shrilly through the empty room, its sharp mechanical chime piercing the quiet night with terrifying insistence. The heavy black receiver rattled against its cradle with every single ring, echoing off the concrete floor like a series of urgent hammer blows striking against an empty iron vault. Deep in the heart of a quiet, forgotten valley village surrounded by dense briars, decaying stone walls, and endless rolling hills, the crumbling ruins of St. Jude's Church had stood entirely abandoned ever since a catastrophic, roaring fire gutted the main chapel back in 1935. The heavy cedar roof had long since caved in, leaving the blackened oak rafters exposed to the elements, while aggressive ivy and wild thorn bushes choked the interior aisles where parishioners once knelt in prayer. Right in the absolute center of the overgrown, forgotten courtyard sat an ancient stone water well, built from heavy blocks of river granite and sealed tightly with rusted iron bars and a massive, weathered padlock since the late 19th century. In the sweltering, suffocating heat of the summer of 2003, during a municipal historical preservation project designed to map out the town's oldest landmarks and subterranean foundations, a 3-person survey team was contracted to evaluate the structural safety of the ruins. I was the lead surveyor on that crew, spending my grueling days measuring perimeter boundaries, calculating grade levels, and cataloging foundation stones while fighting off the oppressive humidity that clung to the valley like a wet wool blanket. From the very first morning we stepped foot onto the grounds, I noticed something deeply unsettling about the atmosphere surrounding the old well. Despite weeks of relentless summer drought that had baked the surrounding soil into hard, cracked clay, the air immediately around the stone rim was freezing cold, damp, and thick with the heavy scent of rotting river mud and ancient wet timber. My assistants refused to set up their equipment anywhere near the courtyard, choosing instead to work out near the broken stone gates where the sunlight could reach them, leaving me alone in the shadowed center of the ruins. On the afternoon of July 12th, while I was taking precise laser measurements near the rusted iron perimeter fence, my footing slipped slightly on a patch of loose, slick moss, causing my heavy steel tape measure to fly out of my hand with a sharp clatter. It slipped directly through a wide gap between the vertical iron bars sealing the well shaft and plunged downward into the pitch-black opening. I rushed to the edge, cursing under my breath and expecting to hear the sharp ring of metal striking deep stone or a loud splash echoing off water at the bottom of a subterranean cistern, but instead, the sound that drifted back up was completely wrong. It was a soft, muffled thud, as if the steel tape had dropped only a few feet and landed flat against heavy, tightly packed fabric rather than falling down into a deep, echoing shaft. Frowning in confusion, I leaned further over the cold granite rim, pulling a small pocket flashlight from my belt and clicking it on to pierce the darkness directly beneath the iron bars. The beam cut downward, exposing the interior walls lined with damp, green-slimed granite, and immediately revealed a horrifying impossibility. The well was not filled with water, nor was it a deep shaft descending into the earth. Suspended awkwardly just 3 feet below the surface on rusted iron brackets sat a large, heavy wooden crate wrapped securely in thick layers of coarse canvas and bound tightly with rotting marine rope that sagged heavily under its own weight. Scratched crudely into the damp canvas using faded white paint was an old, weathered date, August 19, 1888, right alongside the carved initials of the village's infamous founding magistrate, Judge Arthur Pendleton, a man rumored in local archives to have vanished under mysterious circumstances. That very evening, after securing an emergency permit from the local historical board and convincing my terrified assistants to stay with a promise of double hazard pay, we brought a heavy-duty hydraulic cutting torch into the courtyard to slice through the ancient iron bars locking the well shaft. Sparks showered across the wet stones as the metal bars gave way with a screeching protest, allowing us to drop heavy nylon straps down, hook them securely beneath the crate, and winch the heavy wooden box up out of the subterranean darkness and onto the grass. When we finally forced the swollen wooden lid open with a crowbar, it didn't reveal historical ledgers, gold coins, or family heirlooms as we had foolishly hoped, but rather a cold, dead air that smelled intensely of ozone and old blood. When we finally forced the swollen wooden lid open with a long steel crowbar, it didn't reveal historical ledgers, gold coins, or family heirlooms as we had foolishly hoped, but rather a cold, dead air that smelled intensely of stale ozone, damp earth, and ancient, dried blood. Instead of an empty cavity, the interior of the crate was packed tight with dozens of small, handmade pocket mirrors framed in tarnished silver, all laid out face down with terrifying precision upon a bed of rotting dark velvet that swallowed the light of our lanterns. My hands shook violently as I reached down, lifted the first heavy mirror, and turned it over to inspect the glass surface, only to find that every single mirror was completely shattered straight down the middle in the exact same sharp, diagonal fracture pattern that seemed almost mathematically deliberate. Tucked neatly behind the cracked glass of each individual frame was a tiny, yellowed slip of paper bearing a handwritten name and a specific time of day, detailing every single surveyor, engineer, and land registrar who had ever mapped the property over the last century. My breath caught permanently in my throat as I reached the very bottom of the crate and pulled out the final, solitary mirror resting against the velvet lining, its silver frame ice cold to the touch. Scratched onto the yellowed paper tucked behind the glass was my own full name, David Miller, paired with a timestamp that matched the exact current minute flashing on my digital wristwatch, 11:42 p.m. As the digital display blinked forward to 11:43 p.m., the silver frame grew burning hot against my palms, forcing me to drop it instantly into the grass where the glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Before I could even catch my breath, a frantic, dry tapping sound began echoing furiously from deep beneath the courtyard flags, sounding like desperate fingernails scratching against coffin wood from the inside of a sealed vault. My assistants had already bolted toward the trucks in blind panic, their flashlights dancing wildly across the overgrown grass as the stone pavers around the well began to crack and sink inward under an invisible weight. Without looking back or grabbing a single piece of my expensive surveying equipment, I leaped into the cab of my truck, turned the ignition violently, and tore through the rotten wooden gate. I drove straight through the night without stopping once to look in the rearview mirror, fleeing that cursed valley forever while leaving the well completely unsealed behind me. Hours later, miles away from those suffocating hills, parked under the sickly orange glow of an interstate gas station, I pulled down the sun visor vanity mirror and stared at my own reflection in the dim light. A thin, hairline fracture was running vertically straight down the center of my forehead, glowing faintly with a cold silver light that mirrored the glass in the box, proving that some names, once carved into the ledger of the dark, can never truly be unwritten.